If we want to change behavior in the energy system, markets are currently our main tool to incentivize certain decisions. But how does this affect energy justice? Roel, can you say something about this?
Yeah, this is a big question. I think, markets are often presented as a solution that is inherently fair. Just sort of by definition, markets are fair if they, adhere to different types of conditions. But it's a much more complex problem. And I think we should also acknowledge the history of markets. Here in the Netherlands, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange was the first sort of modern stock exchange, securities exchange, that was a product of the Dutch East India Company. And you can imagine all the injustices that were sort of part of that system, right? But it's maybe too big of a story to go into. But I think over time we've come a long way to make markets more just. But there are two big questions that we have to address. First is like, what does it take to enter a market? Am I able to participate in a market? And we see more and more over time that households that haven't been able to invest in isolating their houses, in solar panels, maybe battery systems or charging points, they are not able to enter a market where they're providing flexibility services to address congestion or other issues in the grid. The second question is, does the market really yield a solution? And a lot of our conversations have been about congestion, and congestion often happens in very particular places in the grid. And that means that in those places, you have to look, you only have a small neighborhood or a small area where you might find suppliers, people that can supply service by lowering their energy production or by actually charging at some point. To shave peaks or to make sure that we're not running into congestion. And in many places, markets won't work because there's just no one supplying, or there's very few people, and maybe they're not always happy to do that. So you see that there's more and more different types of contractual agreements and other ways to manage the grid collectively, and markets are not always a solution in that context.
So if markets can lead to these kind of situations, what can we do about it?
I think Roel has mentioned many interesting and relevant challenges for looking critically at the markets as the way to address various issues with energy systems. I think that's super important. I also work often at the level of communities, small neighborhoods where energy cooperatives and new initiatives are emerging. And one of the interesting tension related to what you say, I see, is that suddenly citizens who were acting as consumers of energy are getting together in forms of cooperatives or communities, and they are made as new market entrant to a flexibility market or a congestion market, and a local energy market are being proposed as envisioned that this is the way to address participation, to bring people along and bring incentives and address the challenges of grid congestion and whatnot. But what essentially is getting missed is these new market entrants, they do not have the level of capacities, know-how, information, which is needed for them to act fairly in an energy market. They are competing against certain big players who have a whole team of engineers and market analysts who are analyzing the markets. So we have to also ask this critical question: are these new energy markets, to begin with, are they fair? How can we make them fair? What these new market entrants, actors need to have a fair role in that. Then coming back to the criticality of looking into the market itself, I also sense that we also have to understand that market limits people's role in that of a buyer or seller, which is a very particular limited role which people can have in energy systems, where they start giving a particular very limited meaning to energy as a commodity which they can buy or sell in return for money, and or the price which gets determined by the market. And that shapes their relationship with each other and with energy system in a very limited particular way. There are ways to go beyond that, I think something which we can talk about. But it also limits the meaning of energy as a commodity, a very rational entity which they pay for and they acquire and then they trade with each other. There is no or little attention to the social relationships which people can have with energy system and with each other, and use energy in those mechanisms. And the grid in itself gets imagined in a very particular way as a priced infrastructure, while the grid could be imagined in many different ways if we open up that space where relationships and other ways of exchanging energy which goes beyond just the market mechanism becomes possible.
Yes, well, I think in there is an interesting example that we are working on. If we look at incentives, incentives are usually considered as a financial mechanism, like in terms of subsidies, for example. But we're also trying to think, and in the idea of bringing inclusivity to how different type of groups can participate in an energy system, how incentive frameworks could also be based on a more plural, value-driven approach. So incentives could be addressing issues of privacy preserving, so how can I actually understand and be able to negotiate different ways my life has been seen in a system. So being able to forget to delete aspects of my own practices, but also the participatory aspect of being part of a system, where we're looking into participatory governance and how different type of more transparent ways of contributing to the system can be there. And another incentive is also how we can become more interoperable between different local initiatives, because then it increases the amount of participation from the bottom ground. So yeah, we could look at incentives a bit different in that respect.
Could you give an analogy about a different way of looking at energy?
Oh, Avi, maybe you can bring the analogy of food.
Yeah, so I think an interesting way, or maybe easily relatable, a bit more universal way to think about energy systems, or metaphorically by thinking about food. Like, for instance, across societies, people live, everyone eats food, everyone survives with food. And we also produce food in our own backyards. And now imagine that we live in a society where all the surpluses from your garden you cannot give to your neighbor, you can only sell to your neighbors. How would that be? What it will do to your societal structure, relationship with each other? That is somehow related to how energy system right now is, that there is a local market and you have surplus of energy and you can only sell it to. So maybe Roel, how do you think about
Yeah.
food as an analogy?
Well, I think we're seeing something that looks a bit like this emerging in the Dutch grid, where most of the territory of the Netherlands in terms of electricity grid is facing congestion, is facing basically limits, especially to connecting new businesses, new homes, schools, and other facilities. It's a huge socio-economic problem. One of the things we're seeing is that especially some businesses that they want to entrepreneur and move ahead, they're trying to see if they can optimize their use of energy to create space for other businesses to join the same connection. So then now suddenly there are businesses that are not operating during night, and there's some other businesses say, hey, I want to produce bread during the night. I'm growing my bread business and I want to use electric ovens rather than gas ovens, powered by wind energy during night. And they can connect at the same place and just exchange the capacity from day to night to day again. I know this is still a sort of a commercial, contractual structure, but you can see a principle there of sharing and understanding, the sort of local forms of solidarity emerging to help each other.
Yeah, so one thing which I get from this example is that making energy system connect with how people live, their practices, their different ways, their different things they do in their life, and allowing that to happen, and energy market adding that. So for instance, even with going back to the metaphor of food, when we have surplus from our own garden, we give those vegetables or apples to our neighbors. We don't sell it to them. But of course, we can go and also sell it at the farmer's market. So the current system of how we live with food, it allows for all these possibilities, but those possibilities get limited when we are thinking about energy system. Maybe Natalia, you.
Well, no, I think what is happening also there is that we need to start also translating these different perspectives, because on the one hand, we understand that markets are bringing a narrative on why it's important to structure things in certain ways, while we also see that there is a narrative from the people saying, well, why we limit it, but there's a difficulty in translating those two different values or ways of doing things. So we should also be looking into that in order to make sure that both can combine together and not it's just one or the other.
Yeah.
There's maybe one other example we've seen in our research when it comes to charging electric vehicles. We'll have more and more electric vehicles. They cannot all charge at the same time. So the classical market solution is to impose price and to vary the price around peak consumption so that people are incentivized to charge their cars later or before or after the peak. However, what we're seeing is that locally there's also sort of social connection and justice incentives that people have. Like if I can help my neighbor to charge their car by like charging it a bit slower or at a different point, I might be willing to do that. So there are notions of altruism or social connection that might be even more valuable. What we saw is that they are just at least as valuable or as appreciated in the Dutch context as the price signal.
Yeah.
And maybe even more.
Yeah, I think this is also connected to some of my research where we are exploring in energy systems, in congestion market, flexibility market, beyond just the trading of energy, capacity of flexibility, what it would mean to bring notions of donating flexibility, capacity, energy, or gifting, or sharing. What does it mean? It allows for new possibilities. Of course, there are challenges how that can be embedded in the current energy system, but they open up the space for new forms of relationship which people can have with energy and with each other, and also allows for new innovative services to be thought about how we can deal with these commodities in different ways. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see that market can be useful tools, but they do not automatically lead to the just outcomes, especially since they can limit a bit the participation of smaller players or communities. So we need to look past the prices and incentives and to find some more social ways to manage and incentivize in the energy system. Thank you for watching, and we see you in the next video.